Good morning. It's a language show. Hopefully everyone can see this now. We're starting a couple of minutes early just to make sure everybody can get in. Please put any Q&A in the chat or in the Q&A section rather, and I'll try and come back to them at the end for answering after the session's finished. My name's Elaine Gelder, and you can see my sort of bio there on screen. I am still teaching. I'm working alongside teachers on a weekly basis. And on a daily basis, actually, sometimes. Currently, at the moment, I'm working as Director of Education at LanguageNut, which is an online resource for languages. And I was, up until the end of 2020, working as Senior Director of Languages for a very large MAT in the north of England. Please introduce yourselves in the chat. Switch my video back on. It seems to be playing up today. Please introduce yourselves in the chat and just say whereabouts in the world you're coming from, what languages you teach, and also what level you teach at. So we're due to start. Okay, so I'm going to start the session formally now because it is 11:15. Welcome to those joining us today at the Language World, and I hope you've enjoyed the sessions that you've attended so far. Certainly the ones I've been to have been great. My name's Elaine Gelder, and you can see my bio there on screen. Currently, I work as Director of Education at LanguageNut and have been doing for the last just under 2 years now. Previously to that, I was Senior Director of Languages for a very large MAT across the north of England. But I am still teaching weekly and obviously working with teachers in the classroom. So my experience has been over 34 years, and I've worked in some very challenging and deprived areas in the north of England, and I've also worked some very challenging inner city schools over the course of my time as a teacher. Today's session is very personal in terms of what has actually worked for me, and obviously, hopefully, some of the ideas that I'm giving you today, you will be able to make those work for yourselves as well. Apologies if my camera keeps going on and off. I won't move my mouse anymore. I'll just use my keyboard. So really, when we're talking about languages, we're talking about ourselves really as being like a Newton's cradle. We're stuck in the middle where everything else is going on around us, in terms of you are the constant in the middle. And that's what I find when you are teaching children who do chuck chairs and spit at you, as has happened to me on a number of occasions. You are that middle section that doesn't move or tries not to move while everything else is moving around you in the classroom and also in the actual school itself. The basics that I've always found to be very important when I'm teaching those kind of children have been the structure, because they don't have a great deal of structure in their lives, clarity around what you do with them, consistency, positivity, flexibility, and being attentive. And a lot of the time, the adults that they come across in the world or in their lives, they're going to be quite they're often quite aggressive, or they often don't have time for those kind of students. And so you find that those things there, those 6 things, are very crucial to the kind of teaching that you do with them and the sort of person that you are in the classroom. Any of the resources that I show you today, please send me an email, which I've put on the last slide. I'm more than happy to share them with you. So basically, the students need to know what to expect in your lesson. Give them some predictability. But I always used to still have that element of surprise up my sleeve, which I'll share with you today, what some of the things I used to do. It's good that they know where the learning fits in, the bigger picture in terms of what they're learning, why they're learning it, and how they're going to learn it. Because that then gives them sort of a little bit of security. It's like a security blanket. It gives them the opportunity to see where they started and where they're going. I always kept the sort of exercises and stuff I did with them very short and very purposeful, and I kept the lessons quite pacey and going forward, but with definite content that they were learning. Routines, I always used to meet them at the door and greet them, and then at the end of the lesson, I would let them. We would always have it a very carefully managed, calm lesson exit. Obviously, knowing their names, we all know that as teachers. The start and the finishes, with some of the classes, I used to make sure that there was something either on the board, it could be a long word like Constantinople, and they had to find as many words in the target language as they could. Or even I did it as an English starter, because a lot of those children's literacy levels in their own language in English was very poor. So I used to often treat myself as I don't know why my video keeps going off. I apologize for that. I used to often treat my lessons as literacy lessons, not just for learning a language. I also used to make sure that I had time indicators on the board. So if I was going through a certain number of things, I would stick very rigidly to, we're going to have 10 minutes on that, and then we're going to finish. We're going to have 15 minutes on that, and then we're going to finish. And the students used to enjoy seeing a list of things on the board because they could then see, as we were ticking them off, they were getting nearer to the end of the lesson. And that for them was great, because then they could go out and do their social time at break or at lunchtime, or move on to the next lesson, especially for those who were a bit reluctant to stay in the lesson. And the skills, or modalities as they are often now called, if you're teaching in the UK, you'll have seen all the latest stuff that's going around on languages to do with Ofsted and the MFL curriculum review that was done last year, but also in terms of the new GCSE and other resources that are around. I stuck very rigidly to listening and speaking for most of my students if they were not going to be going on to do a language, because it helped them to be able to, just with their work, I kept a limit to the number of exercises that involved writing. So one of the things I used to do was, I call it locating the learning in the mind of the learner and the teacher. And basically it's being able to say, with my own personal success, the students used to really appreciate knowing what they were learning. So that could be a skill or whatever. And when I used to write my lesson objectives, I used to do them like we are becoming confident to do this, or we are just beginning to do this. And that way, if you are in a school where you are being judged against objectives, because all schools are different, all senior leadership teams and heads and whoever comes in to observe you have your own sort of statistics, success criteria that you are measured by. So I'm trying to sort of link this into various types of things. And again, this might not apply to you, but if you work in a school where this is sort of highlighted as being important, then being able to sort of say, we are beginning to do this, we are becoming more confident to do this. And I've put some things at the bottom there to help you with your lesson objectives that have worked for me. I've also said how we're learning it, what kind of stuff are we doing, and the success criteria up, stepping it, saying today we're going to be learning 20 words or we're going to learn 5 words, or you're going to be able to be confident and recalling 5 words. That used to help them to learn those 5 words. I've managed to achieve that objective today, and it was almost like a carrot as a reward for them. And then obviously the why, because that's the big thing when you're teaching languages. It's a case of what's in it for me. The students used to go, why am I bothering doing this? Well, you've got to try and link that in, and that's the difficult bit. So it's taking time to explain that purpose of the work and why it's important, whether you're linking it to an outside exam, whether you're linking it to being able to achieve a certain level in school, or whether you're linking it to an end project that you're going to be working towards, which again is something which is very important for students that are very truculent to learn and don't want to learn languages. So on here is just a few examples of learning journeys that I've used. So I even have used a waggle, or what a good one looks like. We used to have a wobble as well, what a bad one looks like. Some teachers quite like to use that as well, so they can unpick what's wrong with this piece of work and work backwards then to try and correct it. And again, here we've just got some examples of why I'm learning this, and I would usually display these at the beginning of a session so that the students would be able to see the relevance of the learning that they were doing in the classroom. This is an example of a learning journey, which again would be used maybe for Year 7 French, which would give them the overall picture of where they were going. And they could colour code that. They even like to have those in their books, which they could stick things and maybe put their own sort of comments on, or even have a bigger one on the board that we could use on the wall rather. This is an example again of a Spanish one, I think. Yeah, I believe it is. And then this one is an overall picture, which we all have these learning journeys, but these are just some of the ones that I've used in my time. So another thing that's really important with these kind of students is to have the clarity. I'm keeping an eye on my green light to make sure that it keeps flashing on and off. Is the clarity. the clear expectations of those students, which we've just looked at, but also behaviour. I sometimes used to have an underlying lesson objective that pinpointed behaviour, and that could be bespoke to the child if you have a difficult child in there. I once had a child who actually tried to get out of the window in the lesson, and after that we had a bit of a reconcile, and we had a chat about how he could stay in his seat. So his underlying objective was always to try and not be out of his seat for more than 3 times in the lesson. Clear and precise targets about, as I've said, what you expect them to what you're expecting them to achieve within a given time frame. And sometimes I used to, before the lesson or even during the lesson, I would go in with a ruler, and I would, if we were doing a little bit of written work with exam classes, I would actually put a ruler and draw a line in the book as to where I expected that student to go. And I used to say to them, that's not one word on each line as one little Treasure tried to do. It's about 5 words on a line, and that way you can gauge whether the students have actually met the criteria and they've actually done the work that you've set them. Revisiting was also something to make it clear that we were going to be revisiting some of the vocabulary. So that was to try and combat the boredom level. Miss, we've already done this. Well, actually, retrieval and going over things is important in languages. And one of the things I used to do with them was very early on, I would teach them 10 words at the beginning, and we wouldn't do any more work with those 10 words. And then I would teach them another 10 words or phrases, and we would totally and utterly work through those. And then at the end, we would have a quiz, and we would do, right, I would interleave some of the words from the first 10 with the second 10 that we'd done thoroughly, and to show them actually how little work they'd done on those 10 and how they couldn't retain them. And that actually suddenly thought, oh, you're right about this. You know, it doesn't click with every child, but it clicks with quite a few. You've got to constantly revisit vocabulary, constantly going over it with yourself, either at home or in class, to be able to retain it. And that worked well. And just while I'm on that word of quiz, I never used to use the word exam or assessment. It was always quiz, challenge, competition. That way the students didn't get stressed and they didn't feel that they were being judged. And I know that some people might say that is a little bit like short-sighted because they have to meet assessments and exams in the real thing. But when you've got students who don't want to learn, you've got to try and find every type of activity or every type of language to use with them that will engage them in the learning. Misunderstandings, I used to sometimes think ahead of the lesson, let me just get it in my head clear, what might they misunderstand, so I could address that in the lesson. I might even actually bring that up to them and say, you're going to get this wrong, but that's okay. Fail in safety. Okay. And I've talked about giving examples and woggles earlier in the sheet, in the previous slide. So consistency, remaining calm. It's interesting, isn't it, that some people say, how do you teach children who spit and chuck chairs at you? It's not that you can manage in those classrooms. It's the way that you actually deal with the students. It's putting yourself in that frame of mind. So I used to, when I drove into work, I would have my particular music that I would listen to in the car, and that would get me in the frame of mind. And you're almost like in the classroom, we all put on a model, we all act in the classroom. I would be like that on almost on automaton all the way through the day, but it would be a more engaging type of person. I guess it was easier for me because I'm quite outgoing and quite sort of, I don't teach in a conventional way, but for some staff, I know it can be tricky. And that's why I wanted to share some of my ideas today that would allow you to maybe take some of these away and use them. One of the things that I found quite interesting for me was I actually had a suitcase outside in my classroom, a small suitcase. And as the children came to my lesson, I would open the suitcase, and they would physically take the thoughts out of their head and put them into the suitcase. And we would actually close that and leave it in the corner. And that allowed the students, I got them into this frame of mind of unpacking any behavior that had gone on in a previous lesson, a lesson before that they'd had, or in their lives, to be able to give them some sort of kind of like frame of mind mentally and get that picture in their head that they're unpacking their behavior and unpacking anything that's gone badly before and sticking it in the suitcase. And what really caught me on that was at the end, the students would say, can we unpack that suitcase? And some would go, no, thanks, miss. I don't want to unpack that for now. I've lost it. In your case, I will come and I will go from here to my next lesson and I won't see what's in the case. But some people wanted to physically open the case, miss, take my thoughts out and put them back into my head, which for me was quite amazing to see that happening after you get into a frame of mind of doing that. talking about clear and precise targets and routines is so important, because you get into that habit of being able to ensure that your routines, the children know what to expect. And if things are going to change, let them know. If you're going to be off the next day, or if you're off ill, that's different. But if you know you're going on a course or you have to go to a meeting, letting them know that you're going to be just away for that particular lesson and that you're coming back gives them that kind of like that security blanket that you're not going to be going away. Because one of the schools that I taught in, literally, supply teachers would come in at 8 o'clock and they would leave at 9 because of the stress of one lesson. And so until you build that empathy and you build that relationship with the students, that can take a while, but once you've built it, they often don't let it go. You've got it then forever. Avoiding emotional depersonalization of that sanction and sanctioning the behavior, not the pupil, was something that it took a little bit of time for me when I first started teaching in a city very early on in my career to do. And I know that we all invest a lot of time in our students, and we feel even when we leave that we're letting them down if we go halfway through a year group. But at the end of the day, you know, you've just got to try and think, this is just their behavior. This is not them actually making the behavior. And it's basically making it clear that this pupil is making you have to sanction it and that it's not personal. And following through the sanctions is so important. Acknowledging good behavior and staying positive. So our positivity, acknowledge. You kill with kindness. You're putting on a smiling face. It's exhausting in teaching. We all know that. And going in there with a smile on your face can be the last thing you want to do. But giving them praise and focus on what's going well with the students, allowing them to fail in safety, gives them that confidence. Completion of activities, as I mentioned earlier on a slide about being able to tick off what you're doing, actually physically tick it off. Get your troublemaker out to the front, or several troublemakers, ticking off each time something's done. And I never used to point at students because they used to feel they would maybe get that at home, and that pointing finger can be quite scary for some of them. Catching them in, not catching them out. So catching them behaving well. And setting mini deadlines was something I found out quite early on. We had a situation in one of the schools I worked in where the students would forget their planners, they would lose them. I used to say to them, right, well, let's set a French breakfast or a German breakfast or a Spanish tapas. Let's put in there, we're going to watch a film. Let's put in there a piece of music we're going to work to watching. Let's put in there something that we are going to do. And I used to set the term, some deadlines. And boy, did I stick to them. Because if you didn't stick to your deadlines or what you said you were going to do, they would hold you to account. And I used to build that into my teaching. So if I knew I was doing a breakfast, I would definitely be teaching food and drink on the run up to that. And that's one of the things that I think is really important about being able to sort out your curriculum. It's being able to make the curriculum work for you at key times when you want to teach certain things. So, for example, if you're teaching bodies, I always used to teach bodies around Halloween. And what I would do is I would put a plastic glove with water in, tie it up with string, stick it in the freezer, and then I would take it into school. And I would have a tin of beans, some peeled grapes, and some nuts. And what I would do as a fun activity to start with was I used to put them in a plastic bag so they couldn't see it. And I would get the brave ones, often the naughty ones, to come in with a rubber glove on if they felt it, stick it in there, and they had to guess what it was. So the thing that the first time they met the frozen hand, it was like, oh, what's going on? And it was like it brought the house down. But do you know what? They loved it. Just keeping that little bit of something that they're not going to expect, a little bit of excitement. And the peeled grapes used to be the eyes, and the fingernails, the fingers were the nuts, the nut ends, and the beans were the stomach. So we used to just I used to introduce words like that just in that way. We talk about it in English, and then they talk about it in French. We'd start that with a sort of exciting activity. They used to love it, and I did as well. It was great fun. So going back to this, completion of activities always used to bring a reward, whatever that reward was. I used to use these, which are scrape off, if you can see them. They're scrape off. I'll just get them in my camera. And you can put them on a worksheet and you can have a little reward under them. And they're a little bit like a scratch card. Now, we had a new head that came into one of our schools who said to me, Elaine, you can't use those because it's gambling. I said, okay, that's fine. So it might not work for you, but it certainly worked for me in some of the more tricky classes because the kids used to love it. They didn't know what they were going to get under there. So with flexibility then, being flexible with what you're setting out to achieve. Don't beat yourself up if you don't get through all the lesson objectives, all the things that you want to do in a lesson, because at the end of the day, what you've taught them in that lesson will stick with them if you've taught it well and you've gone over it enough. And also, if don't, with the completion of a certain amount of work, don't worry if you don't get it all done, because you can pick it up the next time, or at least go back over a little bit. I used to drip feed a lot of things with the students, little bits of verbs. And obviously you've got to read the class, haven't you? You've got to see what was the weather like, what's the lesson been like before. So again, it's being flexible. Repetition, I would be often repeat lots of different things all the time. And obviously, at some stage, when I was working in one school, we actually taught the students separately from girls and boys, and that worked quite well with students, particularly then, because I had my strong practitioners on the boys, which often meant me, because that was my sort of kind of, I found that more straightforward. So I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to start whipping through some of my ideas now. So again, we've got the what's in it for me. We've talked a lot about that. One of the things that I used to do at the beginning of the year was ask the students in English, or if they could in their target language, to give me a certain amount of information about them. And you can see it there in that third bullet point. I wouldn't allow them to give me any rude words or dissing of teachers, and I would then adapt the lessons according to what they'd had. So I had a student who was loved Disney, and I used to make sure that there was always a Disney character every so often in my resources. That way you can actually tap into the more truculent students about what they actually enjoy. I would often, staying up to date is something that I did regularly. So with all the singers and all the TV programs and things like that, I would incorporate those into my lesson. And I would often use bits of music to get them to work to, or maybe to finish an item. I'd maybe play a 30-second item of music that they would have to work to. And if they got to the end of that and finished what they needed to do, then they would get a little reward. I often used to allow the students to tell me their information in any way that they wanted. So they could do it on an iPad, they could tape it, they could have topic cards, whatever. But it certainly helped me at the beginning of the year to be able to then create my resources based on their interests. So issues to be aware of are these four. So the environment. You've got to think about your classroom. If you are in a classroom where you've got your classroom is your dedicated time classroom, then it's great. It's a case of, do you have it in a horseshoe? Do you have it in rows and a seating plan? What's your lighting like? I used to find that students that were a bit more truculent used to like lower lighting, and it also kept them more calm. The temperature is something we often don't have any control over, particularly post-COVID. Some schools allow you to have your windows open, some others because of the heating bills. I always used to keep wall displays very fresh with their work, and I would use them as a teaching wall most of the time, because then I could just say, right, what do you remember? We need to look at that. Don't forget about that. And that way you're helping your students to remember things all the time, because when they're off task or they're daydreaming, they can look at the wall and see what's up there. Sometimes would have help sections on the wall as well, where they could go and have a look for things if they were struggling. But certainly my board, the students will be obviously used to being in, maybe have a house that's cluttered, a bedroom. I would declutter my room every day. I would make time to do it. And I would also make sure my board was clean. Also, in terms of the date, I would just have that there, or anything else I needed to have. Graffiti, because you might be in a school where your desks are cleaned daily. I wasn't. So I used to have a little bottle of stuff that I used to clean my desk with. And I got to the situation where even the students were saying, Miss, can I clean your desks at the end of the day? So I kept a pair of rubber gloves, and they used to clean the desk. They enjoyed doing that. They loved it. And then obviously we've talked about the waggle, having that on your board and having some grading criteria if that's what you feel would help your students to know where they're going. So it's important to be relaxed as much as you can, to throw your voice in the classroom, almost like a stone, but not to shout. I would often speak individually to students. And if you find yourself getting wound up in a class, I used to go 1, 2, 3, 4, got to wait a little more. And I would just stop in my head just to get myself and my thoughts together, because the last thing you need is for you to be coming across quite in a shrill voice that I've often seen with teachers. You need to think about your presence in the classroom. I used to think, is my body language aggressive? Is it showing the self-confidence? Or am I being quite sort of timid? And there's lots of books out there that you can read. you're taking on that role, as we all do. You're acting. I must admit, I used to teach a lot from the front, even some lessons, my back to the door, to stop them from getting out and to stop other kids from getting in, because that was how it was in some of the schools that I've taught. It's how you stand. Are you relaxed, but actually, being very in that classroom, being extremely people can understand that you mean business, and how you look as well. We've all got dress codes in school, and your gestures. Never stand with your hands on your hips. Positivity about the language, your language. It's about, don't make behavior a public spectacle. I want you, I expect you, and I never use negative phrases. And as I said earlier, I used to do questions about, we're having a quiz, we're having a competition, we're having a challenge. I never asked a question. I never asked a question because I didn't want to get an answer back. So my advice is, don't ask the question if you don't want an answer. Why are you swearing? Why are you not working? Well, you're just going to create a problem there. I was just to make a statement. So why are you not working becomes, I want you to get on with your work so we can move on. Or I'm just going to remind you about my expectations. I don't want to start giving sanctions. And some of you have forgotten your manners and are speaking over me, things like that. And so we're coming on to the kind of things that I use then. So I used to say, right, start with a big picture and work backwards. What do I want to get out of the students to get out of this unit of activity? And then work out what needs to be taught and share that with them, share the learning steps with them. So here we've got a whole conversation in two ways. I did it as a text or as two types of question and answer, and I maybe would exploit it for phonics, meaning a grammar, and then I would adapt it to themselves. So this would have been a student called Danielle, and I would have put her into there. And I would then use, as you can see there, you've got some glasses and a neck garland. I used to use hats, I used to use scarves, I used to use ties, all sorts of things. The students who would ask the questions would wear one item, or glasses maybe. The students who would give the answers would maybe wear the hats, and then they would swap over and they would walk around the classroom doing it, and they would love it. And I used to have a policeman's helmet for one student to wear, often the naughty one, who would then be my prison guard, and he would go around and he would listen in to anybody who actually spoke English, and they would go into jail and do a forfeit at the end of the lesson. Or they would go around and be reward cop, and they would tick off when they heard somebody speaking brilliant French, and they loved doing that. Okay. Some of the ways I used to use it was, I might give them a speech bubble and then a true or false. I might give them what date is their birthday, and I would give them four choices. I would give them a text, and I would give them the words to be able to then put in there. Or I would give them an a French phrase, and they would have to give me the right ending. Just different ways to exploit it. So that way you're allowing your students to fail in safety. Plenty of variety in the lessons. So I would have, one of the things I did was, I talked about the peeled grapes at the Halloween. When we did illnesses, I would have stick the plaster on the Teletubby. So two students would have the Teletubbies at the back, and I would shout, j'ai mal au dos, and they would have a plaster, and they would run to the back, stick it on the relevant part of the Teletubby. And they quite enjoyed doing that because it's very tactile. One lesson, I arrived to the lesson and I had loads of clothes on, 5 or 6 layers, and I just peeled them off as we learnt the clothes, and the students loved it. Just keeping that variety going. Obviously, we all do the modelling, so it's a case of I do, we do, and then you do, whatever it is that you're modelling. Choral repetition, we all do that. Words with gesture works with students who are a little bit naughty and a little bit needing more room. They like to do things, so I did all sorts of words and made it an actual action to go with it. Involve your troublemakers at the front to maybe teach it with you. So when you do I do, we do, you do I do, we do as the 3, and then you do, and that way would be great. So we'd have two naughty people at the front who I would interchange with others, and that way you could keep an eye on your troublemakers at the front. Lesson endings, it's important to send them away in the right frame of mind. So I would finish early to give out rewards. I would use that as my plenary. And as I was giving out rewards, I would be asking questions as well. Or I would asking them to write down a few words that they could remember from the lesson. Again, the quiz gives you that low stakes environment. And lots of different things in the senses. The smells when we did food, the taste, the sight when we did kind of things like chocolate, or when we did items of vegetables, which some of them had never seen, some of the vegetables, and I actually took them in a bag to let them look at, and we actually then chopped them up and had a look and see what they were. So it's appealing to all the senses of the students. It's being so creative and thinking of as many things as you can. Mini whiteboards, I could do a whole session on mini whiteboards, but I used to sometimes get them to draw a bit of cross-curricular, draw a triangle on the whiteboard. And I want you then, because that then just takes language out of the head, and they quite like fiddling on whiteboards. And I want you to make that triangle part of the word that we're going to write or draw. And they would have to draw a picture in the triangle, and they would have to write the French on the outside. Even if it meant having the French, German, Spanish on the board, and it was a copying exercise, you are reinforcing all of that, spelling, learning, all of that in their minds on the whiteboards. They could do large writing, they could do bubble writing. Just keep changing those different types of activities that you use on the whiteboards. Props, costumes and wigs. I used to have loads of those. We used to dress up and do role plays and things. Some students hated writing, so I would get a box and I would cover it, or even just a box, and I'd give them that to write on, and that would be their box, which I would store at the back of the lesson. Tablecloths you can buy quite cheaply, the ones that you can put on the tables and actually write on them. Fold them up, whatever way you want to do, keep them in the box, and the students can then use that as their writing. I always color-coded nouns, masculine, feminine, neuter if you do German, or I would keep adverbs in one particular color and verbs in that, because that way the students understand what colors represent the verbs. And I would also replicate that in my wall displays. Blocking together, if you're teaching the definite article or the indefinite article, keep those words blocked, keep it consistent. I would always teach le, la, le, or der, die, das, or the Spanish, and we would always know that that was what was going to go on, and it would be much later on when I was bringing the other definite or indefinite article. So that's why it's so important to block together all of your masculine words, all of your neuter words, all of your feminine words. Then I would try as much as possible to link what we were doing to types of jobs that they might be interested in. And there's a lesson plan a little bit later on, and I will upload the PowerPoint after this, of when I had a group of just boys who were doing bricklaying. And so what we did, we went on to Le Bricolage, which is the DIY in France. We looked for all the tools that they needed to build a house in France, and we set up an imaginary project. We went onto the IKEA website in France, and we found all the different bits and stuff. We bought items of other stuff on eBay France. We didn't actually buy them, we just screenshotted them, or we cut and paste and put them into that. And the same way with a very difficult group of girls that I had who were all into hairdressing. So I thought, right, we're going to go on a Caribbean cruise and we're going to speak some Spanish. So what we did was we kind of imagined that we were doing all these activities of how you would do someone's hair. So we did the body, how you would talk to them in terms of like what kind of conversations you might have them with people that were your clients, and we did it that way. And we produced an end of unit assessment to go with that. Sometimes what I would do is I would have a freeze frame in the lesson. If the class were getting a little bit out of hand, I would say, right, freeze frame. And they would all have to freeze in the position that we're in. That way I could then ring in the behavior back to normal. But it also meant that you could, if a child moved, they would lose a point. I used to give them sometimes 10 points at the beginning of a lesson, or 5 points, depending upon how naughty they were. And if they lost any points, they would lose a reward. So if they moved in that freeze frame, they would lose a point or even 2. And then at the end of the lesson, when we were actually counting up the rewards to actually put them on the system, because that's the thing I used to find with teachers, the time thing, build that time to reward those students on the system if that's what you have to do, rather than thinking I've got to do it at the end of the day. Build it into the system, but while you're doing it, give them something to do, because they can actually see you doing it. And that way they believe you, because a lot of the time they think, oh, it's just another teacher, they're not going to do that. Okay. I used to say, right, I want you to listen for a word I'm going to use in the lesson. And if you hear that word, I want you to write it down at what time it was that I said it. And if you get it right, you'll get a prize, or you'll get secret student. I always do in the very first days. I would choose a student, can be anybody, stick it somewhere in the lesson on a post-it, either under a chair, under a table, and then I would say to them, right, if you at the end of the lesson look under your chair, wherever, if you've got that, then you are the secret student. If you've behaved well in my lesson today, then you can choose one other person to get double house points or whatever you have in your school, and the rest of the class will get 1 point. And that way, I carried it on quite a long time with some classes for the whole year, because they never had an idea where I was going to hide that. Sometimes I used to just use the thing that you can use on class toolkits, where you can just send like a roulette wheel around and choose someone. And if they'd behave best, then really well, then the whole class would get a reward. Spelling backwards helps as well for some students. I used to get them to see the word and then spell it backwards. They used to enjoy doing that. I always am very mindful of the cognitive load of how many words you teach in a class. And my own way of doing it is just to teach 9, because that way 3, 3, 3, you can have rows of 3, you can play noughts and crosses with it. And a lot of students enjoy learning when they're in there, they can remember the 3 top words. So if you're asking them to repeat the words, they can remember one row, they can remember that row, they can remember that row, and you can fill it in on them. Current advice is 20 receptive and 10 productive is what you can remember in one lesson. Going back to the speed of retrieval as well, is if we'd done a set of words and I wanted them to learn it, I would give them the same set again, maybe 3 or 4 weeks later, and I'd get them to write down what they could remember, and they would have a stopwatch on their desk. 2 things I used to have: stopwatches and mirrors. Mirrors to be able to look at and see how the word is formed, and that way it aids your phonics, and stopwatches to be able to time how you're doing it. And they would often then have a sheet in the front of their books, or even the first or last page in their book, and they would say, right, week 7, I've done this vocab and I did it in 27 seconds. Week 7 again, 3 or 4 weeks later, I did it in 29 seconds. So I'm getting worse at it, or I'm getting better. And they used to enjoy seeing their own achievements there. Mirrors I've talked about. Karaoke is something that I did a lot of teaching inner city, because I used to have and I still have it, a big microphone, and we used to go and sing the song around, and we used to tape it and record it then. And the students used to love it when they could have that word. You know, we'd sing like, I don't know, je me lève, je me lève, and the whole class would be singing it, because we used to sing the daily routine to the Addams Family with a backing for that, and they would love that. Daydreaming is something that I did very much in my latter years of working in a city, where I'd say to the students, I want you to sit and daydream for 1 minute. Then once you've done that, here's a whiteboard. I want you to draw on what you've daydreamed. And we would then get them to sort of think about, come up with some of the words. And I would just tease out some of the vocabulary. And we would learn that then, maybe 6 items of vocab that the whole class had on a daydreaming activity. And we would incorporate that then into our future work. Caramba is something that's been around for a while, and this is where you have your lolly sticks and you put a word on one side in French or German, Spanish, the English on the other. You stick them in a pot and you pull them out, and you play this in groups, and if you get it right, you keep it and you have another go. If you get it wrong, you put it back into the pot. Some of my students used to learn lollipop sticks. They loved this, and they used it as revision at home for their exams. A reading window can show you an example of that. And again, I've got all these if you wanted any. Some of my students we used to give them a reading window, and this is where adapting your teaching comes in. They would just read what was in that. So I'd give them a text, and they would have a different size window for their ability to read according to their reading age, and they would just read in that. Another tip for reading is to have a ruler. It's what they do in primary school, and they read a text line by line, and you go through it with them that way, and it does help them to engage their motivation when it comes to reading. So I have taught many selective mutes, and it's difficult teaching those students. And so I developed this where they had their own sort of ABCD. So if they had a question or they wanted to give me an answer, they would give it to me this on a key ring. And I also then developed this, which I just put together with a tag. And again, you can have copies of these. And this was the first one, the skills I practiced today were. So if you work in a school where you've got to show progress or something, the student would then just give me that, and they would write the answer on a whiteboard. So that way they were participating in the lesson. And there's all sorts of things, you know, it's important thing. The hardest thing for me today in the lesson was, and I would just have these ready for that student. And I've got several others that I can, that I've used in the past as well. Okay, so this is, I won't dwell on this because this can be seen on the PowerPoint, but this is a blow-by-blow account of a lesson that I taught in terms of being able to support and give students of that kind of level and that kind of behaviour level a way forward of learning, and it was very successful. So using rewards, celebrating success, obviously. And one thing that I can't stress enough to you is, for me, working in a city and challenging, is that timing, which I've put a little bit down, I think, the timings of the stepped pyramids. I would have almost like 30 stepped pyramids of what those students would get in rewards in terms of even just a phone call home, an email them, a text them, something like that, because you don't want to give them a big reward right at the beginning, else you've shot yourself in the foot. You've fired all your bullets, so to speak. So I would always give any rewards that I was giving, like letters home and stuff, the week after half term, because if you give it in the last week of half term, then it's kind of forgotten, because they go home, they're happy, but then they come back in the Tuesday after the half term, and you're starting again with that student. If you give it in that week, then you're going to benefit for quite a few weeks after that. I've had a letter home from you, miss, and it's Tuesday of the first half term in October, whenever you go back November, and then that warm glow sits with them, and you will see that in their lessons, and it gives you that opportunity to build more relationships with them. Obviously, if you tweet about the students, not everybody does, but that might be something that you use. Getting parental engagement, getting them to come in, give a prize draw to parents who attend, and you have some sweets or some vouchers or something. Lesson endings I've spoken about, and stepped reward pyramids. But you need to make sure that your rewards are properly earned, are wanted, they're age specific, and they're refreshed. And here's an example of an actual certificate that I've used. Obviously, you can give out certificates in assemblies, you can get your heads of year involved, you can have screens around the schools. And this is an example of one of my learning journeys where the students are in control of what they're learning. So I'm conscious that I've got 6 minutes left, and I'm just having a quick whip through. So I'm just going to go through quickly what I think I might leave that one, because we've covered that one. Yeah, one of the things that I always find really important is to do what I call the martini verbs. And those of you that are of a similar age to me will remember the advert martini. It was like anytime, any place, anywhere. Well, I used to bring that into my verbs, and I used to think, right, let's see which are the top verbs that the students need for to access any of the writing activities on the actual test they're going to be doing. And so we would do it in these ways, and we would have it in like this. This is an example of how I would get them to refresh that and go through it in class. And then for vocabulary, I have something called Vocab Crunch, which again, you can use in different ways. The students can do it either testing themselves like that, they can cut it up as pairs, or they can just have it and use it as with 4 on, and they can just fold it across like that. The other thing I used to do was 3 of each. So I didn't overburden my students with lots of vocab, as long as they could give me 3 colours, 3 negative opinions. And I went through the syllabus and I thought, right, what are the things that are going to come up? And if they know 3 of all of them, they can more or less, and it will be bespoke to that child, because it will be very much about what they want to learn, not about what you're trying to shovel down the neck in terms of like, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, because then you're making it very bespoke and giving them the opportunity to get a better mark in the exam. So they would have 3 of each. This again is an example of a sheet that I might use. I might pre-populate that for the students, or they might do it themselves to support what they need to say in their speaking or their writing. And then we're coming on to some of the things that the students loved. The balancing butterflies and clouds. They used to walk around the class with these, and I've got templates for them if you want them. And we would make them in class, revising colours. And then on the back, they would have some words that they found difficult. And they would walk around the classroom asking each other what those words were, or testing each other on their words. And they just enjoyed it, because it helped their fine motor skills, but also it's very good for calming the students, because if they fall off their finger or their nose or their ruler, then they're going to lose some points. Another thing we did was we would, build stuff like the Eiffel Tower. One of my students, a selective mute, drew a picture of herself and put all her words on there. I managed to get some cheap t-shirts from Primark, and we made all our words on there, and the students would wear those around the class or around the school. This is just a sheet of wallpaper where I got the students to lie on it, draw around it, and they would put words on it. And we played Twister and all sorts of things. And this is a project we did primary school. This one is probably, out of all these, is not my idea. It came from someone else, but it's where they would make a house as an end project. And then here we've got painting on stones. We've got writing on balloons. We've talked about this with the garlands and the glasses. And here we've got making paper trees with vocabulary. We just did all sorts of vocabulary to remind them how to remember stuff. And some of the students loved doing that as an end project. And then we had a vocabulary Oscar for the person who remembers the most words in the week. Just ways of doing it. And again, I'll just go quickly through these. So one of the things I sometimes use are masks. and I would have, the students would have a mask, they would have a picture of themselves or a person, and they would write a dialogue on the back, and they would then go around talking about it, talking to other people, or we would record them behind the mask if they're very, very unhappy to speak in terms of confidence. Leaves and sticks, I took in loads of leaves and sticks, and the students would make the words out of the leaves and sticks. They love doing that. It's very tactile. A pencil case, we got them to make a pencil case, and then they would put all of the words on it. Again, that was an actual end product. We even made a clock, which we made out of paper plate, and we put a twisty pin in, made the actual hands on it, and we decorated the clocks with numbers. And that was a final project that we did. And they love doing things like that. And card sorts, making their own card sorts to be able to use at home or with another class, is also something that they enjoyed doing. This is an example of the work I spoke about when I was using the boys with their working on their houses, building them, you know, and the boys who were doing bricking and stuff. And if you wanted to look at that, and then this is an example of how I would use my dressing up box. Again, you'll be able to see that on the PowerPoint. And then this is an example of how to build confidence in speaking. And one of the things that I found a lot of my students enjoyed was to use color-coded concert bands, which is where they would put their words, and they would actually wear these for a few days or take them on and off as they did. And again, that's how I would use building confidence in speaking to do that. And then fun with writing. We've talked a little bit about everything I would do there. And then I think that is the last slide. But I cannot believe I've managed to get through that. It's unbelievable at 12 o'clock. So hope you've enjoyed the session. I will have a look and see what's in the chat. That's great. Some of the feedback's great. Lovely. Yeah, fantastic. Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you to loads of people there. So, okay, have a nice day and hope you enjoy the rest of Language World. Language Work, the language show.